So, greetings everyone. I hope you're all well and warm and safe. Welcome to what is the first 2021 event of the European Union seminar at the Center for European Studies at Harvard. This is a special event. It is the second iteration of the Day of France at Harvard. And without further ado, I'm going to give the floor to the Consul General of France, Monsieur Arnaud Montret, and then I'll be back for a description of the event.
Thank you, dear Nicolas and dear friends. It's a real pleasure for me to welcome you to this second edition of the Day of France at Harvard. It's an event we launched in 2019 to promote public discussions between Harvard professors and their French counterparts. For the first edition in 2019, in collaboration with the Harvard Center for European Studies, we were all together in Memorial Church to discuss democracy and justice, the future of science, but also literature and history. And on that occasion, we celebrated the exceptionally warm relations that exist between France and Harvard University, with founding figures such as Stanley Hoffman, Georges Doriot, and so many other examples. Today, there are more than 40 professors of French nationality at Harvard, in the Harvard community. So I think it's a good symbol of these very warm and deep relationships. Since this launch event, a pandemic has occurred. We are all on Zoom, but I think the appetite for transatlantic exchanges on today's most pressing issues remain intact. And so at the French Consulate in Boston, we believe in the exchange of ideas between the two shores of the Atlantic. We also believe that it's important to give the floor to the great professors that dedicate their life to research, and so reject generalizations and easy concepts. So I very much look forward to today's discussion between two inspiring figures, such as Michel Lamont, the renowned professor of sociology and director of the Weatherhead Center here at Harvard, and Pierros Avalon, professor at the Collège de France, our most prestigious academic institution, now part of PSL University. And I couldn't think of a better moderator for this discussion than Nicolas Prévelakis, lecturer on social studies, a great specialist of the history of political philosophy, religion, and politics. The theme of today's discussion is populism, democracy, and recognition. Professor Lamont, you wanted to add this third concept of recognition, and I'm sure you will explain us why you thought we should have it in this triptych. Our democratic societies are all confronted today with new political phenomena that challenge our traditional vision of representative democracy. And despite clear historic as well as socioeconomic differences between France and the US, we should ask ourselves whether there are some common features. What are the implications for the relations between the government and the people in terms of voting, listening, governing? And is there a risk of a bidding war between public action and expectations? These are only a few of all the questions that are related to this crucial issue. So I'm very looking forward to your answers, Professor Rosanvallon and Professor Lamont. Thank you for being with us, and thank you to the Minda de Gunzburg Center for European Studies, a leading institution at Harvard, and a wonderful partner for the consulate. Nicolas, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and many thanks to the consulate for all the inspiration, the vision, and for making this event possible. Obviously, many thanks to the Center for European Studies, to its executive director, Elaine Papoulias, who is here with us, Vasilis Koutifaris, Laura Falloon, and all the others who made this event possible. Many thanks to our speakers. The seminar on the European Union is interested in what is happening in Europe broadly, and populism is a central topic that we address, as it is a central topic of interest for the Center for European Studies more broadly. There's been a lot of discussions about populism in recent years with many events. We've talked about Brexit, we've talked about Trump, we've talked about many such events in Europe. There's been a lot of talk regarding whether or not there might be a bad and a good populism, whether or not populism is something coherent or not such so coherent after all, what it means for liberal democracies, what message does it send, whether or not it varies from one country to another. And we're fortunate to be able to draw comparisons today between France and the United States, two countries that have a lot of similarities in their political culture, but also significant differences, as we've learned recently, both in academic life and through discussions in the media. What kind of thing lies behind populism? Is it about the economy? Is it about recognition? And how do we respond? How do we respond to that? Are the responses institutional? Are they economic? Is it about something else? We are extremely fortunate to have with us two major thinkers who have dedicated years of their lives to studying these questions, both in the US, in France, in Canada, but also thinking about it from a global perspective. The schedule is as follows. We will give the floor to the two presenters, and then we'll have a discussion. I'll say more about that, but first of all, let me introduce the speakers. Our first speaker is Professor Pierros, who is a very well-known French historian, sociologist, and political thinker. He's based in France, but also part of the Harvard community, since he was at Harvard a few years ago, 2009, to talk at the time about these issues, including recognition, probably, with Michael Sandel and Charles Taylor at the time. He's professor at the Collège de France, holding the chair in modern and contemporary political history. He has a very long trajectory in both academic and intellectual life. He has studied French political history. He's a specialist on the role of the state and the questions of social justice in contemporary societies. He has been director of studies at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales. He led the Raymond Aron Center of Political Research. He's one of the primary theoreticians of workers' self-management. He created the very famous intellectual workshop, République des Idées. Of course, he's the author of many books that are relevant to today's topic. I'm not going to mention all of them, but a few of them that have been translated in English recently. One is the Légitimité démocratique, Democratic Legitimacy in English, translated by Arthur Goldhammer of the Center for European Studies in 2008. La Contre-Démocratie, Counter-Democracy in English, again, 2008, books that are directly relevant to the topic of today. And of course, recently, Notre Histoire intellectuelle et politique, which has not been translated in English, published in France in 2018. I'm not going to mention all of them. I'm just mentioning again the kinds of works that are relevant to today's discussion. Without further ado, I'm going to give the floor to Pierros, and then I'm going to introduce Michelle Lamont for her own presentation. So Pierre, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I first would like to thank the organizer for inviting me and also for this opportunity to discuss with Michelle Lamont. When we deal with populism, there are two avenues of discussing populism. The first one is to understand populism as a reaction. And we could say that if the proof of the pudding is in the eating, the proof of populism is in the voting. Because almost everywhere in the world, we see that there are populist parties winning the election, coming to power, and in many countries also populist movement or populist parties gaining a lot of votes. So it's not a local problem. It's really one of the main international problems in the political sphere today. And of course, it's a reaction from this point of view. It's a reaction, it's a symptom, we could say, of the failures of our democracies. This is because our democracy don't work well in terms of representation. They don't work well in terms of an effective sovereignty of the people. It's because our democracies in some way are in danger. And I think there's a symptom of these democracies in danger. But it would be limited just only to have this vision of populism as a reaction. Populism is also a proposition. Populism is a political proposition and in some way a very attractive and appealing proposition. Of course, a lot of votes are negative votes today. You don't only vote for something, but mainly in some cases against some people or against some parties. But you vote also for something anyway. And I think we should consider populism from this positive point of view. We should we should take populism seriously, I could say. Populism it has been said that populism was a thin ideology. For one among the first theoreticians of populism, they spoke of thin ideology. I think, on the contrary, that populism is a very thick ideology. Populism is a borderline democratic ideology. And I think we should consider it from this theoretical point of view. There are three dimensions concerning populism as a political ideology. There is first a vision of democratic institution, and second, and there is a sociological vision and also an art of government. A vision of democratic institution first. I think it's a vision of legitimacy and a vision of representation. A vision of legitimacy considering that legitimacy only derives from election. So it's a vision of a political institution criticizing independent authorities, criticizing the judiciary, criticizing constitutional courts. And everywhere in the world, we see that populist movement and populist government, they try to destroy constitutional courts. They try to destroy independent authorities. They try to destroy the judiciary. And for a democratic reason, because I say the judges, perhaps with some differences here between France and the US, judges are not elected. Independent authorities are not elected. So they are not legitimate. And it's also in this direction that they consider in some cases that the press, freedom of the press could be a problem. Napoleon III was in France the first theoretician of populism. And his expression, he said to journalists, nobody elected you. You are only some talents, you are only a capital, people with money, but you have not been elected. Me, I have been elected by millions of people. So I am entitled to limit your interference with the political sphere. I am entitled to say that you are not legitimate. You are only special interest. When, as an elected leader, I am the general interest. And you see today in Poland, I take a European example, in Poland or in Hungary, Orban has exactly this kind of discourse concerning the legitimacy of the press, of opposition. It's not a legitimate press because it's press of special interest, not press expressing the people. That's the first point. In some way, you could say that it's a a definition of an immediate democracy. Very often we speak of populism through their attraction for referendum, but it's not direct democracy only. It's also a vision of immediate democracy. A democracy where there is no intermediary body between the people and the leader. It's a reason why it is also a theory of representation. This theory of representation considers that the leader is the incarnation of the people. To speak again of Napoleon III, he has his expression. He said, "I am a non-people, a man people." And this expression was very famous in Latin America because it is an expression that was very frequent in the discourses of Chavez. He said, "I am not Chavez. I am every one of you. I am a man who is at the same time the people." And this vision of incarnation is very important because it means that it's not bottom-up politics. Normally, a political party comes from normal people and they elect representatives. And they elect through a Congress, they choose through a Congress certain kind of direction. When it's on the other hand, could say that populism is coming from is downside politics. It's populism means that the leader make an offer to society, and that he doesn't need any kind of political party. He's a direct link with society. So it's a kind of representation as incarnation. And it's also a dimension of immediacy in politics. So through this vision of legitimacy and representation, you have the definition of what we could call an immediate democracy. But there is also a sociological vision of populism. Populism as a conception of the people as a unified people. Normally, democracy is supposed to act within a very diverse society, and political parties as a representation of the diversity of society. And the organization of civil societies represents the diversity of society. When populism considers that there is a unified people, a unified people not only defined through what is common to these people, but defined from the point of view of its enemies. It's an agonistic view of democracy and of the people. Also a moral definition of the people. The real people is not only the majority, the real people is a people which is the incarnation of the values of society, of the supposed values of society. That means in this direction that arithmetic and even election are not enough to represent to the people. The people is more than an arithmetic majority. The people is a sum of values, is a sum of qualities that are not only derived from the fact of an existing majority. It means also that you could be a minority in the election and consider that you are, in fact, the real people, the real majority, because arithmetic is always balanced in some way by morality in the populist vision. And when Trump said, well, we won the election, he meant that he was stronger than arithmetic. And the reality, he was the real representative of the people with his moral dimension. And the arithmetic was not the truth of the election. The third dimension of populism is an art of government. It's an art of government with three main points. The first point, that it's a government dealing with emotions and not with interest. A government dealing with values and not interest. And that is a very strong point of populism, because everybody's everybody has emotions and consider realities through emotion, through personal vision of society, and not only through reason, through rationality, through interest. And the populists very well understood that in our days, emotions are very often stronger than interest. And with a consequence that you can negotiate between interest. A compromise is always possible between interest, but a compromise is not possible between emotions. A compromise is not possible between values. It's the reason why there is populism makes politics harsher, makes politics more violent, make political discussion as a kind of war between values. It makes something very new in the field of politics, because all democratic politics was based on this vision of interest that could be different, but that had to come to power sometimes and to leave power some other times. And in a way, the role of government was to negotiate between different interests. But you don't negotiate between different emotions. The second element of the art of government, of populism, is a creation of alternative reality. It is a propensity to develop conspirationist vision, conspirationist approaches of reality, because reality is not a reality of facts. Reality is a reality of emotions. Reality is a reality of a kind of moral definition of reality. Reality is what is good for you. Reality is what goes in the direction of your ideology. So, this conspirationist vision of populism has a very strong epistemic foundation. And it is the reason why it plays a so important role today. The third element of the art of government, of populism, is a vision of the exercise of sovereignty. Populism put the emphasis on the necessity to take back control, to take the slogan of the Brexit. But to take back control, how to take back control in nowadays? To take back control with one key element, that is protectionism. Because the limit of the political will is the limit of the discussion with others. But through protectionism, you regain some possibility of sovereignty. From this point of view, there is a centrality of protectionism, the fight against immigrants, the building of borders that are the recreation in some way of a new room for sovereignty. That's the third element of populism. When you take those different elements, it means that it is really a strong ideology. But we must not forget at the same time that populism not only exists through populist parties, through populist movements, through populist government, but it also exists today as a kind of global atmosphere in our democracy. Populism is at the same time a thick political theory and a general atmosphere. Who could say in France that Macron is a populist? It would be difficult to say he is a populist, but at the same time, his movement, La République en Marche, is also based on the principle of incarnation in some way. So you see that even in some kind of movement that could be far from being considered as populist, you have also some elements of populism. Populism exists today as an ideology and as a global atmosphere. I will just finish to make some remark for how to criticize in an efficient way populism. very often, the main critic of populism is to say that populism is illiberal. Of course, he is illiberal. In the facts, he is illiberal. But populism will say, well, we accept to be illiberal. We want to be illiberal because liberalism is against democracy. When you say democracy is based on one hand, universal suffrage, and on the other hand, the rule of law, they say, no, democracy is one. Democracy is universal suffrage. If the rule of law means the power to minorities, the power to judges, so it's undemocratic. So if we want to have an efficient critic of populism, we should consider how those elements we call liberal are elements that could be included in a theory of democracy. It means why judges are representative, why they do represent in some way the general will. It's because the general will, nobody can say, I am the general will. So you must in some way to approach the general will. You could say democracy from this point of view is at the same time the power of everybody incarnated in the majority, let's say, but it's also the power of nobody. It means that some institutions can be owned by a specific party. And independent authority are democratic authorities in this sense that they don't belong to any specific party. They belong to everybody in this direction. I could say also that democracy is the power of anybody. It means that one single person is important. And what makes that a single person is important is the protection of the Constitution. It is why the Constitutional Court is a democratic institution, because it is a kind of representation of the general will, of the past of the general will. In this direction, it's a democratic institution and not only a liberal institution. And just to a last remark to make the junction perhaps with Michel Lamont and dealing with recognition. Because one of the failure of our present democracy is its failure in terms of recognition. A lot of people, they think they are not recognized. They think they are not represented. And it's not only through election that we could fulfill this purpose of recognition and representation. I think we should also develop what I call a kind of narrative representation. And I think that narration is part of democracy. At the very moment of the crisis of the 30s, Roosevelt had the idea to launch a program called the Federal Writers Project. And the purpose of this Federal Writers Project is to make possible for a lot of photographers, of novelists, of journalists to describe the reality of what simple American citizens were living through films, through movies, through pictures, through even touristic guides, through novels, through some kinds of journalistic investigation. And I think today it's one of the dimensions of democracy that has also to be reinvented. So populism is part of our present for a very long time, because we have to repair democracies. And we have not only to defend democracies, because existing democracies are not democracies that have fulfilled their promises. There are a lot of broken promises. So we must not only defend democracy against populism, but rebuild our democracies to avoid the power of populism. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm sure that there are important things that the audience will remember and that we'll discuss. I'm keeping thick political theory for populism, the idea of a general atmosphere, the idea of narrative representation. These are, I think, concepts that we'll discuss. If there's students of political theory amongst us, I want to just signal through Pierre's speech how important it is to study the classics and notions of general will, Rousseau, all these things that we study, how relevant they are in understanding today's world. And last but not least, the importance of exposition in three parts, three subparts. I noticed this trois parties, trois sous-parties, which is the French way. It's since we have a Day of France in exposing things, which again, if there's students amongst us, I'm sure that they will appreciate it. Thank you. I will move now to Michel Lamont, who doesn't need an introduction at Harvard, of course, or beyond. Who is professor of sociology and African American studies at Harvard. She's a member of the Center for European Studies, but chairs a seminar. She's director of the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs, in which she has done a monumental work in introducing discussion on issues of inequality, recognition, and also populism, all these things that we are discussing today. She is a fellow of the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research. She has published many books in different domains. She was in France in the late 70s, if I'm not mistaken, working on Bourdieu and publishing a book on money, markets, and manners. And doing work precisely understanding the values of ordinary people. Again, something that I'm sure has relevance with what we're discussing today. Since then, of course, has published many other books, including one about how professors think inside the world of academic judgment, very important for us, reconsidering culture and poverty, social resilience in the neoliberal era, successful societies, how institutions and culture affect health. So again, many ways to explore issues of inequality, recognition, and that will help us understand populism. And of course, Michel, you developed this notion of recognition gap, which I hope we'll have the chance to learn more about today. Without further ado, the floor is yours, and thank you for being with us.
Merci beaucoup, Nicolas, for this very kind introduction. It's a real honor to be here today, and I want to thank Arnaud Montré, as well as my dear colleague from the Center for European Studies for including me in this event. I'm very pleased to be able to share the screen with Pierros Avalon, whose amazingly immense expertise in the field of political history and intellectual history gives him the tools he needs to really shed new light on this phenomenon of populism. I have not had the chance yet to read his book, but I'm extremely simpatico with the idea of thinking about representation in a much broader way than we have so far. And I look forward to engaging with him in a few minutes about some of the key points of his presentation, for instance, the role of the court in relation to representation. And the American Supreme Court, of course, doesn't look at all the same as the French higher legal instance. So it will be interesting to think about the implication. I'm a sociologist, and I've written books that have titles such as Getting Respect and The Dignity of Working Man, which means that my point of entry into populism is not populism. It is really how people think about their worth. And it's about the deficit in a feeling of worthiness. You know, the expression who's legit really captures this idea that different groups are construed as more or less worthy. And as a sociologist, I focus on this phenomenon of recognition that, you know, you find in Hegel, but more recently, Axel Honneth, the German philosopher, has defined it as a social act by which the positive social worth of an individual or a group is affirmed or acknowledged by others. So one example is when 32 states in the United States passed the same-sex law. the same-sex marriage law, there was a very rapid and drastic decrease in the number of LGBTQ youth who are in high school and who attempted suicide. So it's an example of how receiving from the institutions, important institutions around us, the legal institutions that define what marriage is, the notion that who you are is legit, translate in an immediate increase in subjective well-being and in health. So the parallel phenomenon is that of stigmatization. So we just spent a very hot summer with Black Lives Matter, massive movement, the largest movement we've ever seen in the US, in protest of the stigmatization of African American and violence of police toward African Americans, where the quest for dignity, for respect was expressed loud and clear. So this question of groups seeking cultural membership has become really front and center in the way that Americans at least understand their society. And while these dimensions of ascribed characteristics, such as race and ethnicity, have historically been far less salient in the French context, with the transnational movement of ideas and social movements, there's now, as we read regularly in the New York Times, questions of race and ethnicity and gender are being debated in the place publique in France with increasing intensity, and right now with enormous polarization in the intellectual class around these questions. Just a few days ago, February 10th, you may have seen in the New York Times a full-page article titled "In Simmering Race and Gender Struggle, France Blames US Ideas." So it's a moment where a number of French intellectuals have signed, I think 100 of them, a statement denouncing the ways in which post-colonial theory is being imported from the US to France and is feeding a cancel culture that they believe is extremely unhealthy for the nature of the French intellectual debate. At the same time, where of course you have another group that is decrying this position and saying loud and clear, we have plenty of evidence now. The evidence, while the Republican refusal of seeing racism as an important part of French reality has been there, forever. Over the last decades, there's a mounting amount of empirical evidence from sociologists and demographers and others. I'm thinking about the work of Patrick Simon or Myrna Safi, demonstrating how members of minority groups experience this discrimination on a daily basis. So the question of the quest for dignity and recognition is really at the center of much of what's happening politically. So one could say, well, what does this have to do with populism? Well, it has been feeding populism all along. We can very well see these movements, the quest of recognition among members of minority groups or women who are not a minority group, really parallels the quest for recognition that has been feeding the support for Trump and Le Front National. I wrote a paper with two of my graduate students where we did a detailed analysis of 73 electoral speeches that Trump delivered during the 2016 campaign. And we were able to show through very detailed empirical data, the ways in which his speeches were very much oriented toward, of course, offering the populist argument that are well known, but also very much bolstering the identity of workers, telling them, yes, you feel like you're devalued, that society does not recognize your role as essential workers, the crucial contribution you make to society. We know you're downwardly mobile. It's not your fault. It's because of globalization, which displaces you. And I'm going to be there to defend you in relation to immigrant workers who want to take your place, in relation to the Chinese who are stealing your jobs. So very much, defining himself as the one who will increase the valuation of this group. So these games of status acquisition are a basic cultural process that unfolds in politics all the time. And we can look at the growing popularity of populism through these cultural processes of stigmatization and recognition, and the mobilization of institutional structures and cultural repertoires in how these frames are changed, which is not exclusive of a focus on political ideology of the type that Pierros and Avalon proposed, but there are complementary lenses, different but complementary lenses that are able to illuminate different aspects of the political and social process that leads us to where we are now. So I want to step back a little bit and provide a little bit of background to remind us that we are living in a very peculiar moment. Although we are in the middle of a pandemic, before the pandemic, we were also in a new age of a very acute and extreme inequality. And this has ossified or crystallized the growing hegemony of the upper middle class in most advanced industrial societies, in the sense that we are the group, professionals and managers who are college educated, the top 20% of the occupational structure. We are the group that has been able to monopolize more resources over the last decades, but we also incarnate a script of self. And what's a script of self? It's a set of characteristics that is associated with neoliberalism, which has become hegemonic over the last 40 years. And this script of self celebrates self-reliance, the fact that, you know, we are able to pull ourselves by our bootstrap and we're not depending on the state to make a living. We are people who are competitive, who are oriented toward the performance of professional success. And we also celebrate and incarnate meritocracy. And these values are constantly celebrated also by the mass media. When at night we sit in front of the TV and binge watch, the people who are presented to us are people like us, professionals and managers who present those virtues. And when working class characters appear, which studies in the mass media, the work of Richard Butch, for instance, finds that the workers basically never appear. If they appear, like in The Simpsons, they are buffoons, they are ridiculous, infantile men who are, put down. So you have through the media, through the entertainment industry, constant reaffirmation of celebration of meritocracy, which is very much perceived as an affront to the working class. Now, this current regime, where this hegemony of the neoliberal scripts of self of the upper middle class is very, has nefarious effect for the working class and the upper middle class alike. We know, for instance, that the American upper middle class is currently facing a massive mental health crisis, where the top 20% is facing too much stress. Data from even before the pandemic showed very clearly through surveys, for instance, that many professionals and managers said they were facing too much competition, money and work were just creating too much stress. And they are very scared of downward mobility, which means that they push their kids into living a world of hyper competition, which creates a lot of stress in the family and which is also very hard on the kids. So data from the UCLA freshman survey, for instance, shows that the amount of stress on the children has grown enormously. I don't need to give you a lot of detail on the working class. I presume you've all read that by Despair or heard of it, the opioid epidemics, the many ways in which this crisis of recognition that the working class is feeling more acutely is having terrible effect on their well-being. So how about France? In 2000, I published a book titled The Dignity of Working Man, where I compared white and North African workers in France and white and Black workers in the US, a comparison of Paris and New York. And I argued then that it was much easier for French workers to define themselves in opposition to the upper half. They were far more critical of professionals and managers, in part because their class solidarity still at the time when I did these interviews in '93 remained strong enough that they viewed themselves as having more integrity and more class solidarity than their American counterparts. So the American workers were kind of stuck in the role of being losers no matter what. And they could not define themselves, they could not find a way to find value amongst themselves in the context. Now, recently I wrote with Nicolas Duvaux, one of Pierros Avalon's students, a paper looking at how these scripts of self have changed between '93 and 2004 when we finished our paper. And we found that in this context, French workers were becoming more and more like their American counterparts. So this leaves French workers who you know, even les petits moyens who fed the Gilets jaunes movement as feeling even less worthy than they did a couple of decades ago with the growing focus on individualism and consumption. So it's not a pretty picture in France. It's not a pretty picture in the US. And like Pierre, I'm going to conclude by saying, you know, what's ahead of us? How can we address the situation? There's a great many books that are being written on how to address the situation. Our colleague, Steve Levitsky and Danielle Ziblatt, for instance, wrote a wonderful book on the crisis of democracy and the ways in which it has been weakened over the last decades and how to address it in the cultural domain, which is my area of specialization. I'm partly concerned with the work that is now being done to address recognition. So I'm writing a book which focuses on agents of change, people who are producing new narratives about what defines a valued self across a number of domains. So for instance, I've interviewed some of the leaders of the Me Too movement. I've interviewed stand-up comics. I've interviewed the guy who produced The Handmaid's Tale. So I'm looking at the entertainment industry, all these sectors that are telling young people and adults, what kind of self should we have to be valued? And a lot of these new narratives that are emerging are narratives that are celebrating inclusion, diversity, sustainability, and are really moving away from the ideal self that was celebrated by the American dream, with its focus on upward mobility, at a time when we know that upward mobility is less and less likely. Young people are not buying houses, so they have to turn elsewhere to define who they can be. And what we find I also, with some of my students, did a lot of interviews with Gen Zs, people who are now between 18 and 22, about how they imagine their future. And the inclusion and the idea of what I call ordinary cosmopolitanism is very salient. So what we see emerging is really a notion of a plurality of ways of being worthy, which is, I hope, likely to unsettle Trump's grip on the working class. I mean, that's a very long-term process. How do you move toward an American society that's able to tell workers you are worthy? You don't need to have a savior such as Trump. We accept that in order to be worthy, you don't even need to have a college degree. Being someone who's inclusive, who respects other human beings, who has, a concept of what is a good life that is not totally anchored on material accumulation is sometimes something that we support. So at the end of the day, my book is very much oriented toward having a collective discussion about what kind of society we need in order to help foster shared cultural repertoires that will help move us toward a society where the culture of consumption and materialism is less hegemonic. So this might seem like we're very far away from populism, but I think that, like Pierre, I'm very concerned with the roots of populism, but I really approach it more through, the question of, through empirical analysis of what are the values through which people define worth. So I think I'll stop here, and I look forward to exchanging with Pierre about where these disciplines, where these discussions are heading. You're muted, Nicolas.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much. We have 25 minutes. What I suggest is that you and Pierre take 10 minutes for a discussion amongst yourselves, and then I'll bring questions from the public. By the way, now to the public, if you do have questions, feel free to start writing them in the chat. That will make it easier to share them with Pierre and Michel. I have one quick comment on Michel's presentation, especially this idea of cultural repertoire. You mentioned the notion of consumerism and winners and losers, which is prevalent in America. Of course, the book that I read and made me realize that there's probably a big cultural difference between at least my experience in France, my experience in the United States. Max Weber, Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. You have to pretend, always show, demonstrate, perform being amongst the saved. And you are amongst the saved when you win, win, win. And that is, I think, prevalent in the United States in a way that's not that much in France. I'm just throwing this out as a way to maybe enrich this conversation about similarities and differences between France and the US.
Yeah. Well, if I may just respond to this, since it speaks directly to the talk I just gave, we know from our interviews with Gen Zs that they are braiding repertoires that have historically been viewed as contradictory. So they embrace the therapeutic self, the notion that you need to have a balance, that you need to take care of your mental health, but they also praise hard work and entrepreneurialism, which is part of the American dream and the neoliberal ideology. And at the same time, they also embrace this notion of everyday cosmopolitanism. So whereas, you know, the self that predominated in 1960 in the context of American exceptionalism was far more, you know, the Horatio Algier, you know, pull yourself by your britches and come, you know, go work on Wall Street. This generation is not at all interested, in part because they're burnt out. They have parents who have, you know, harassed them with success and with, you know, GREs and college entrance competition that I think is having now a huge counter, you know, backlash. So Pierre, may I ask you a question?
Yes.
So this notion that the legal bodies are not elected, and because of that, they don't fully represent the general will. What do you make of the situation where in the US, the Supreme Court is nominated by the party in power, and yet it has to be approved by the Senate, and it represents the Constitution? You know, it gives voice to the Constitution. So how would you compare the US and the French situation in your analysis, given our respective legal structures?
I would say that a theory of a constitutional court would be a theory of a real independent body. In France, it's not really an independent body for two reasons. The first one is that the former president are members of the court. That is really something strange. And the second point is that the members, the other members of the court, are nominated by the President of the Republic, the President of the Senate, and the President of the National Assembly. So they are more or less representing the political parties. And in the US also, you have this kind of specific representation, which makes that today, in fact, the court is considered as less legitimate than before, because it seems more political. And so when I see that, when I say that the Constitutional Court should be an independent body representing in some way the history, the memory of the general will, it would be a court to be redefined. It's not to consider that today's courts in the US as well in France are really representing this kind of ideal independent bodies. But we should go in such a direction. Same thing for independent authorities. As you know, they have been invented in the US for the problem of transport. What is a real independent authority? How should it be democratic? It's not from the point of view of a process of nomination, a process of election, but democracy here means transparency, explaining, making things public, making things accountable. I think democracy is not only defined by procedures, but also by a set of qualities.
Exactly.
Democracy is defined by qualities. So when I say we should defend another vision, positive vision of a democracy to be rebuilt, it's not saying that the existing institution, existing independent authorities, existing courts, they represent what should be for the perfection of those institutions, not at all.
Yeah.
But I have also a question to ask you. In some way, you insisted more than me on the roots of populism. And of course, I feel very comfortable with all what you have said. You should have started the discussion with the root and after the institutions. But one point strikes me very much today, is that there is a kind of battle for dignity. I remember your book on the dignity of working men. But today, when you consider populist parties, they say, well, in fact, we are the real minority. We are underrepresented.
Yeah.
We experience contempt, and we experience injustice. We experience misrepresentation.
Yeah.
And one point is that in our society today, there is a kind of battle for recognition. There is a kind of battle for contempt in some way. And some workers in the US, it's very clear, but it's a 19th century model. In the 19th century, men were exploited, but they became dominant because they could exploit women. And white people, they were exploited, but they were strong and proud because they could be racist. And on the other hand, also working men in the late 19th century in the US, you had the nativists. They were very proud to be nativists and to be French in France. And so for a very long time, the pride of working classes, has been built on the contempt for other people, contempt of women, contempt of immigrants and of foreigners, and contempt in the US of black people. And today we have a kind of reversal of the situation. But at the end, I think we should consider politics from the point of view of the experience of people. And people have practical experiences of injustice, practical experiences of contempt, practical experiences of discrimination. And the purpose of politics is to try to unify society through those vision. When today it's a competition within all those different fields. It's competition for pride, it's competition for integrity, it's competition for justice. And a lot of people are building this competition. You mentioned the 100 intellectuals in France saying, well, we have to consider very seriously for problems today. The problem is not racism. The problem is racism against white people. And it's also very common in the US to say that. But there is a construction of this battle. And
absolutely. And its character is changing a lot. What you are pointing at too is something called sense of group positioning. It's a very basic social process that has been discussed a lot in the literature. And there's a lot of social psychologists now and political people's expert in political psychology who are doing experiments and using various methods to try to understand what can we do to attenuate the sense of threat that people have as other groups are gaining in importance or able to monopolize more resources than they did in the past. And one of the key is what's called contact theory. giving groups more opportunities to interact with each other. So for instance, Jonathan Misch in our department studied what happens when in college you put together students who come from different ethno-racial groups. Living together in the same room for 4 years, it means that they really get to understand better what are the challenges that the members of other groups are experiencing. Or we know that in the US, the extent to which class have become segregated spatially has increased enormously over the last 20 years. And as the funding of the school system depends on local taxes, this is just getting more and more exacerbated. So there's a real need to revisit the structure of school financing in the US as a very root cause of growing racism, because race and class are correlated. So I think in terms of us, our obligation as social scientists, really to put on, to redefine what are the questions that we focus on in such a way that we tackle the transformation of group boundaries, the fact that they are becoming much more visible and less permeable when it comes to, class, much more than race, because in fact, I think the awareness that American citizens have now that a lot of African Americans are middle class. We've had a president who was, the incarnation of the Black middle class guy. So, but nevertheless, this sense of threat that you talked about is extremely strong, and even stronger is the polarization, as we know from the last American election, between the rural and the urban, which corresponds also to differences in level of education, the cosmopolitan versus the provincials, if you want. So
one answer is also to give a sense of visibility, to fight against invisibility.
Yeah.
Some years ago, I launched an experiment called Raconter la vie. And we published more than 30 books and a website coming from novelists, journalists, or simple citizens. The purpose was to make visible some invisible. And I think democracy is also helping to make visible invisible people. Representation is not only that you have your say in the nomination of a delegate, is to say that you become visible.
And I would say,
represent means to present your problems.
Exactly. And I think at that level, things are changing at the speed of light in the US in terms of the visibility. There's expressions that are central to the Gen Zs, such as, I lift up this group, or I am seen. This language of being seen is now becoming omnipresent. Every morning I'm on my Peloton bike and I listen to the, I don't know if it's a big fashion in France, but under COVID, many people do stationary bike in the morning. And this company Peloton has, trainers from a wide range of ethno-racial group. It is very interesting to see how deeply the language they use to talk about their lives has to do with recognition all the time. And when I see the reaction in France, which against racial and gender recognition among sociologists who I know very well, old friends such as Nathalie Yeniche or Gérard Noiriel, who are opposing it for all kinds of reasons, and also lining up with Macron, which I think they would never have thought they would ever do this, in rejecting the importance of recognition. So to me, it's very interesting. It's very puzzling to see how much the two countries are heading in opposite directions when it comes to politics of recognition.
Yes.
So,
I hate to do this, but I want to interrupt just in order to share a few questions from the audience, given that we have 10 minutes. And so I'm not going to read them. I'm just going to mention a few themes that you might want to address. Many are asking about the civic education. You addressed it a little bit, but also what's happening at the universities at the time where the departments of humanities are being destroyed, diminished. Any thoughts on that? You mentioned mostly the US and France, but many people are saying in Latin America, we've had populism for a long time. What insights can we get from that? What about racism and the idea of white men losing dominance in society as an explanation for populism as frustration? What about the idea of plutocratic populism, the idea that racist resentment is being used, exploited by plutocrats for their own interest? And then finally, one from me, are there any elements from populism as described by Pierre that liberal democracies can use? For instance, more attention to emotions. I'm thinking elements that are good to be integrated in liberal democracy. That's it, shortly.
Why don't you go ahead? Yeah.
I could say just a few words about Latin America because it's important in the US. Latin America has been the continent for populism in the 50s of the 20th century. After all, the first theoretician of populism has been a Colombian, Gaitan. Gaitan, who almost came to power in the late 40s, but he has been assassinated. And he was a master at the same time of Chavez, of Perón, and of Castro, también also. And in the Latin America, populist movement and populist governments, they had all the kind of specificities I mentioned. But with one difference is that today in Europe and in the US with Trump, populism has been a left-wing movement and also a sectarian movement. When in Latin America, it's most of the time, it has been a left-wing movement. It meant a movement connected with redistribution. I would say at least for one moment, because even in the Ecuador of Korea, even in Bolivia or in Venezuela, relatively quickly, populist government became corrupted government. And they had also an attraction for making impossible the election of the others. It means to make possible for them a permanent re-election. It has been a very common tendency in Venezuela, in Bolivia, and also in Ecuador. That is a common point that makes at the same time the specificity of Latin American populism, and at the same time also a general laboratory of what populism is in terms of representation, of vision of the general will, vision of the people. After all, the only book written from a populist point of view to make a theory of populism was written by an Argentinian professor who was Ernesto Laclau. It's the only it's the only theory of populism written by a populist. It's the reason why I try to write a theory of populism, not by a populist.
To this, I would add, Bernie Sanders is totally a populist. And, this is a very good example of how redistribution is not at all incompatible. And I want to mention for those of you who are not aware of the work of my colleague, Bart Banachowski, who has written about the points of convergence between left-wing and conservative populism, which I think is really worth reading. If you go to his website, he's now at NYU, you will see he has a lot of really powerful analysis of populism. And I must say he diverges with you, Pierre, to the extent that he doesn't think of it as a thick ideology. He thinks of it as a thin ideology. He says if you compare it to nationalism or conservatism or liberalism, it is far thinner as a set of body of knowledge than these. And then he says it's a discursive template that gets braided with these other major and well-constituted ideologies. So I'm not an expert on this. I just want to mention it. But one of the questions you mentioned, Nicolas, had to do with civic education. And I think that there's a lot of interesting things. We know, for instance, that in Germany, there's a massive program of civic education that was put in place after World War II to really diffuse a civic culture that would be, not open to authoritarianism. In the US, there's no centralized curriculum. The states are responsible, and it's really the very local, each of the school systems are entirely, or not necessarily entirely, it varies somewhat across states, but we don't have any such structure, which I think is a huge problem. As a non-American myself, I'm often very puzzled by the inability, and of course we see it now with the pandemic more than ever before, the problems that the American political structure creates when it comes to coordinating action of any kind. So, public interest announcements have been used in many African countries to address the AIDS crisis. There's a lot of tools to create social change that are available to more centralized societies that are not available here, which is why one has to turn to civic society, social movements, NGOs. The NGOs are playing an enormous role. You have a number of foundations that funded the Black Lives Matter movement. There's a large movement of progressive philanthropies that are behind that. So I think we cannot understand how cultural change happens in the US if we don't take into consideration the role of the civil society and the NGOs and the foundations.
So I think we're running out of time, unless I'm being told otherwise. I want to thank our speakers, Pierros, Avalon, Michel Lamont, very much for this engaging and stimulated talk, which, if my understanding is correct, will soon be available online, recorded for everyone, including those who couldn't be with us today. A huge thank you to all the team of the Center for European Studies, all those who made this event possible, the Consulate General of France in Boston, not only for this event, but for all the collaborations that we've had for many, many years. And to all of you who joined us from the US or from other parts of the world, including parts of the world in which it's now very late, and who contributed questions and comments. I'm sorry that I wasn't able to share all your questions and comments, but we have them, and so we'll share them with the speakers at least. Many, many thanks once more to all of you.
Thank you very
Goodbye.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good to see everyone.
Yes. Bye-bye.